Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we will be exploring the concept of paradigm, and we'll be asking the question, is there a new paradigm emerging? With me is Arthur M. Young, the inventor of the Bell helicopter and author of the Bell Notes, the Reflexive Universe, and the Geometry of Meaning. Arthur is also the founder of the Institute for the Study of Consciousness in Berkeley, California. Welcome, Arthur.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you again. When we think of the age in which we live, I'm sure most people would agree that we take many, many things for granted that people in previous times didn't. And I guess that has something to do with what we're talking about when we use the term paradigm.
Well, I hope people know what you mean by paradigm. Reminds me of the story of man, who is that lady I seen you with? That was no lady, that was my wife. Mm-hmm. Well, that could be applied to a paradigm. Mm-hmm. If you talk to a normal person and say, what paradigm, he wouldn't know he was in a paradigm.
Yeah, most people wouldn't know.
He would say, that isn't my paradigm, that's what's the truth. Mm. And the reason you change paradigms is because you have a new view of what the truth is. Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't call what you're living in a paradigm, because a paradigm is something you can put on the shelf or something. You can take it on or off. But that's the trouble with the age, is they're stuck in what they think is the truth. Mm-hmm. And we're getting a lot of things now that are quite different from what we're used to.
What do you think is wrong with the truths that are held in the current age?
Well, rather than say what's wrong, I'd rather finish this thought of what is the truth.
Okay.
Well, we're currently in, for instance, Christian religion. It wasn't always Christian religion. But at the time, if you go back to Roman times, this was a new thing. And some people believed in it, and they stuck to it, and eventually the Romans joined up mm-hmm. and became Christians. And then we've been living in the Christian age for a long time.
Yes.
Now, it would horrify most religious people to think of having it any different. Mm-hmm. But in a sense, you said yourself when we were talking that Christianity was a paradigm. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think good Christians would think of it as a paradigm. They'd say that isn't a paradigm, that's the truth.
Maybe that's a definition of a paradigm.
What is?
That people take it that way.
Well, I would say it's a paradigm after you're finished with it.
In other words, there's something very elusive about the concept of paradigm.
Yes, but you're thinking of it as a thing, you mm-hmm. see, as a thing you put on. You wouldn't think of the truth as a thing you put on.
Well, modern philosophy, though, often refers to it that way. We live in the era of...
I don't give a damn about modern philosophy. They've pushed themselves out into a side alley. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about what you really believe. Mm-hmm. Now, do you believe in flying saucers, for instance?
Do I believe in them?
I'm not asking you a question. Right. I'm giving an illustration mm-hmm. of the belief.
Yes.
And a lot of people will say they don't believe it. There's no evidence.
Yes.
But, and then we have a thing called this skeptical inquirer, mm-hmm. or the psychoptical. Yeah. Committee for Investigation of the Alleged Paranormal, I think it is.
That's right.
Well, they believe in skepticism. It's just as much a belief as believing in flying saucers. Now, where does that skepticism come from? It comes from the scientific method, which we've been living in for the last 300, 400 years. So that is our current belief system, the scientific approach.
Well, it would seem to me to be generally the case that Western culture is based on a
Right.
as much as religions still survive, they don't have the paradigmatic power over our culture that they once had and that science now has.
Well, that's exactly it, except when you say paradigmatic power, I would rather say they don't convince people of truth.
Yeah.
And people would rather go to science as the touchstone of truth.
I think most people today kind of understand, at least intuitively, that all over the world are many different religions claiming to be the only one, and yet all over the world are sciences. And for the most part, scientists around the world are in agreement with each other about what is truth.
Right. There's an illustration, I've used it before, a book, I've forgotten the name of the author, I think it was Nicky, but he was surveying the world's religions very carefully to see what was common to all these religions. And one of the things he found that was in the majority was reincarnation, the pre-existence of the soul.
Yes.
But he said there's no evidence of this, no scientific evidence of the soul, therefore I won't accept it. Well, now I would ask, what is his religion? You see, he was using science as a criterion for truth. So that shows that we're in this scientific paradigm, if you want to call it.
Yeah.
But scientists wouldn't think of it that way. He would say that's the truth.
And it sort of goes like this, that if it hasn't been scientifically proven, it's not important, it doesn't exist, it doesn't deserve my consideration.
Right. Well, I think we're about to change that. In fact, I think it's the only way we can save the current situation. But first I want to go back and find out how we got into this scientific way of thinking.
Yes.
And it's necessary to do that so that you can see there's an alternative. Because I wouldn't begin to do this if I didn't think that there was truth in something other than science.
Well, you know, I think there's a great irony if you look at the founders of Western science, Francis Bacon and Sir Isaac Newton. They all had a very deep mystical side.
Well, I keep bringing that up with regard to Bacon. He was one of the ones that recommended the scientific method, the experimental method. But he limited it to secondary causation. Primary causation was the business of philosophy and religion.
Yes.
But of course now science is doing primary causation. They're talking about the Big Bang. What are the fundamental particles? All of these things are primary causation. And it's not equipped to deal with primary causation. I'd like to mention, I started on this interest in philosophy when I was back in college. I was not satisfied with relativity. And one of the things that struck me, and it's still not recognized generally, maybe I haven't paid enough attention to it myself, the difference between nouns and verbs. One way to put it is, well, I don't know whether you remember Clauser lecturing at the Institute.
Yes, John Clauser, the
Right.
physicist from Berkeley who did tests on Bell's theorem, which is another long story.
Well, it was actually the EPR experiment.
Yes.
To validate. He thought he could prove that Einstein was correct, that these particles going in opposite directions would not be in touch with each other. But to his great surprise, now this was a thought experiment. The EPR experiment was intended to,
to disprove quantum physics.
Excuse me?
It was intended to disprove quantum physics, wasn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
I was going to say a reductio ad absurdum of quantum physics by saying that these two particles that are shot out from the same source couldn't possibly, according to quantum physics, they were to remain in touch with each other.
Yes.
And that was ridiculous, so quantum physics was wrong.
Einstein said that if it were true, that would mean the particles were telepathic, which was obviously an absurdity.
Right.
But it turned out to be true, and Clauser is one of the people who proved that.
Right. Well, it was a good lecture, and we were fine, but we asked him how did he feel about this, because it was a disappointment to him, the experiment. And he said, well, let me review, and then he started to do the math over again. We said, oh no, we don't want that math again. We want to know how you felt. So finally he said, well, I felt very badly. I had to give up either locality or objectivity, or maybe both. And then I tried to console him by saying, well, you wouldn't expect to find verbs in the refrigerator, would you?
With the salad.
Well, this business of putting all the verbs in the refrigerator, making everything into a noun is what I'm talking about.
Yes.
And with the action left out.
That's what
the scientific paradigm does.
this is your complaint about modern science.
Right.
Puts all the verbs in the refrigerator.
Right. Now, normally, Kuhn said, and most people would say, and I believe you did.
Now you're referring to Thomas Kuhn, who wrote the book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions.
Right. Well, he was the one that introduced the word paradigm, made it popular.
Yes.
But, well, now I've forgotten my point.
Well, you were talking about what he had to say.
Well, this business of quantum physics was a new paradigm. He was giving an example of a new paradigm.
As opposed to classical physics.
Right. But when I've been studying it, I've had to study it because it wasn't courant when I went to college, so I've been studying it. Well, they made findings, very important findings, like this EPR experiment, and mainly the quantum of action. But what do they do with the quantum of action? They call it a particle.
The quantum of action is the basis of quantum physics, isn't it?
Right. But the nearest comparable thing is decision, like you decide to get out of bed. Now, that's the reason that's a quantum is because you couldn't get out of bed 1.5 times. You can't decide to do anything 3.4 times. It comes in units. Now, that's an action. But to call it a particle, just because there are all these other particles,
It's putting the verbs in the refrigerator.
right. It's leaving out it's not learning the lesson from quantum physics. Well, if you bear with me then, I'm doubting that there was a paradigm shift at the time of quantum theory. So my next step was to go back and explore the paradigm shift that was known as the Copernican Revolution.
Yes.
That was the time when Copernicus had this theory that maybe the Earth went around the sun instead of the sun going around the Earth.
Yes.
And to my surprise, there was about 170 years between the birth of Copernicus and the birth of Newton.
Yes.
So it was a long time because Copernicus didn't insist on his theory. It was he just said it's an idea. And then Tycho Brahe, who made the careful observations right after Copernicus, and was supported by the church because they wanted an accurate calendar, he didn't believe the Copernican theory. But he made the observations that made it possible for Kepler to calculate and show that we were going around the sun and not the sun around the Earth.
Yes.
And that led to Galileo and Newton And of course, by the time Newton came along, it was accepted.
Mm-hmm.
See, of Galileo, they put him in the Inquisition and made him promise not to publish it. But Newton, they said, who was it, Pope said, God said, let Newton be. So Newton was blessed, but between Copernicus and it was unknown and Newton when it was accepted, it was a long time for this revolution.
Yes.
Well, my conclusion or my thought was this was the same time when they were trying to suppress witchcraft.
That's right.
And that was a long ordeal. They were burning witches, but they still kept on having witches.
They were burning them for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm.
And finally along came this new idea of science, which, how did science treat the witches?
Science would say that witchcraft doesn't exist.
Right.
Yeah.
That was the way to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
Say it doesn't exist. But it does exist. And it's being discovered, or it's been discovered in this work that's been done subsequent to the Philadelphia experiment.
Well, what work is that?
Well, I'm referring to, first of all, the Philadelphia experiment. Do you remember that?
Well, I have some vague idea of the Philadelphia experiment being a situation in which the U.S. Army allegedly caused a ship to disappear.
It was the Navy.
It was the Navy.
And they did, well, they caused a ship
Did
to
they use
disappear.
witchcraft?
No, they used magnetic fields.
Mm-hmm.
And Tesla was in on it at the beginning.
Nikola Tesla, the
Right.
fellow who actually invented alternating current.
All these lights.
Yeah.
Things.
Our modern electrical grid system we owe to Tesla.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Very great inventor.
Yes.
Well, he realized it would be harmful to people,
Mm-hmm.
personnel, the crew, in other words.
The crew of the ship.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Well, they did make one disappear without a crew, and it got back, so that was great.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, they had to have a crew on it if they're going to operate it.
Mm-hmm.
I should say that this began with what's called degaussing.
Degaussing.
Gauss was
Mm-hmm.
the one after whom magnetic fields are
Mm-hmm.
named.
Yeah.
And the magnetic field acquired by the battleship wandering around the ocean in the Earth's magnetism was used to set off bombs, which would blow up the battleship. So the thing was to degauss the battleship so it wouldn't blow up the bombs.
Oh, okay. Well, this is all very confusing to me, and I understand it's quite controversial, too. I doubt if the Navy would even admit to any of it.
Oh, the degaussing? Oh, that's perfectly
Or the
okay.
making the ship invisible.
Well, they didn't try to do it anymore.
But anyhow, you're saying that this is related to witchcraft.
Well, it became evident that it was when they experiments were continued.
Mm-hmm.
And till 1983, experiments having to do with making things disappear
Mm-hmm.
and magnetic fields,
Mm-hmm.
and then it led into thought control,
Mm-hmm.
mind control, and actually causing animals to go berserk and even cause crime waves, things like that.
By bombarding them with electromagnetic fields.
Well, that would be purely physical and purely scientific.
Mm-hmm.
But this was more than that. This was the use of what would be equivalent to witchcraft.
Yeah. Well, of course, I think it's well known at this point that the American government and the former Soviet government for many decades was involved in psychic research of various kinds, and
Right.
in other words, the power of the mind to influence other living systems or to
Right.
obtain information from other living systems. And this is what you are equating now with witchcraft.
Well, it all goes together because it doesn't fit into science.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm putting it into a big basket called witchcraft. But
Yeah. And what we're looking at, I think, fundamentally goes back to the EPR experiment in physics and your discussions with Clauser, the very notion of objectivity itself.
Right. Breaks down.
Because if the mind can influence things directly, the mind can no longer be considered objective and separate from the whole universe.
Well, I don't mind the objectiveness, but I also want to take into account the projectiveness. And that's why I brought up action.
Yes.
You see, action is not an object.
Right.
You can't put it in the refrigerator.
Right. Yeah.
So we begin with a distinction between an action or a project. Project is a purpose. Remember, Bacon banned purpose from science because it was fundamental, not because it wasn't important. See, it's perfectly reasonable to ban purpose from technology, for instance. See, if you tried to get a patent on fishing, they would say, or flying, I want to patent flying. You can't patent flying. You have to show how you do it. Then you can patent that device.
Yes.
But the birds are flying. They're not violating patents.
Yeah.
Well, the same way about fishing. So purpose is no help to a scientist. But to a cosmologist, it's very important because purpose is what's running the universe. And if we recognize that, we'd go back to God via science.
So in a way, when we look at paradigms, we can say that the religious paradigm, the religious worldview that was replaced by the scientific worldview is now being reborn in some sense through science.
Well, I don't see much of it coming from scientists, but the discoveries of science make it necessary to interpret it that way.
Yes.
You see, if you're going to admit purpose in science, then each person has a purpose. You're going to have freedom, and they're getting that purpose from their higher selves, and their higher selves are somehow divine. So you get back to God. But it's not God in the sense of an old man with a gray beard up there. It's the source of everything, that which makes the world creative. The flowers, the beasts, all the fish, everything is part of this creative urge. And I would hope that the new paradigm would reinstate that beautiful creativity.
It sounds like you're arguing that we replace the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with the God of the philosophers.
Well, if I was going to say you name it, but the whole point of God is it's ineffable. It's neither male or female. It's not a person. It's not a flower. It's something ineffable. It's indescribable. And of course, that's another reason of not putting it into science.
Yeah.
But science can't put quantum of action into science either because it has to be uncertainty. So if you admit uncertainty, see, Einstein didn't want any uncertainty.
Well, it sounds like, just as you seem to be saying, that science is incapable of, or has at least to date been incapable of grasping the quantum of action, which is the basis of most modern science. Neither is religion capable of grasping God, which is the basis of religion.
Well, I don't know. We were talking about paradigms, so I was saying, I hope it's made it clear, that it's not so much paradigm shifting, but groping for truth that we're all doing. And when science began, it was a genuine search for truth. You were asking questions of nature and getting the right answers, and that was true. But it didn't mean that there was no such thing as this other part that was rejected because it wasn't objective.
First cause.
Yeah.
First principles
Purpose,
that Francis Bacon said we had to exclude from science. It became the realm of philosophy, and shortly thereafter even the philosophers said we have to pass over this in silence.
Well, to some extent it's a result of the fragmentation which science is suffering from anyway, But first there was division of church and state. Now that was a big battle way back about the time of the witchcraft thing. But separating witchcraft from science, separating religion from the state, separating physics from chemistry, everything is fragmented now so that nobody understands enough to put it together.
Mm-hmm. And if we're going to have a new paradigm, it's got to be a way of putting these things together.
Right.
Mm-hmm. There ought to be some sort of a unitary principle underlying the verbs in the refrigerator.
Well, you're more into parapsychology than I am. I'd like to ask you what you think would put it back together.
Well, you talked about the quantum of action as being fundamental, and it seems to me that that's as good an answer as any I've heard.
Well, let's translate it into human terms.
Mm-hmm.
Take it as the learning cycle, which I think is the same as the action cycle.
Yes.
They're both going around.
Mm-hmm.
And what is this going around? Well, the infant reaches out and touches the hot stove, and oh, ouch! And then he says, stove hot.
Yeah.
And then the fourth step is he avoids it.
Yeah.
So he's learned something.
Mm-hmm.
I remember my wife's grandchildren, they could neither of them could talk. One of them was older than the other. And we were in the dining room, and the kids were in the living room. And all of a sudden, Sylvia rushes in and says, "Chris, ouch!" Well, Chris had stuck his finger in the electric light bulb and got a shock.
Ooh.
So, but she was able to speak.
She understood. He couldn't talk.
Right.
Arthur, we're out of time now, but I see what we're getting at here is that underneath putting it all together is still the human being, still our own consciousness. I think we'll have to leave it with that.
Well, the human being and the cycle of action
Yes.
are very similar.
Thanks so much for being with me.
Well, thank you.
And thank you for being with us.